Hi, this is Debbie and I'm sharing a video I created for my Doodling with Debbie series for SSS Stamp. Today I'll be painting this gorgeous spring flowers background from SSS Stamp and giving tips and tricks for NoLine Watercolouring. I'm briefly going to break away from my normal chat about what I'm doing to say that I filmed this video in chunks over a few days because at our house we are all very much involved in looking after my daughter's 10-week-old puppy. People talk about mum brain. Well, I think there must have been a bit of puppy brain going on, as I can't find the footage of stamping this background. I can't have pressed record on the camera at the time. However, you haven't missed anything vital, as I simply placed the background stamp in the Misti, inked with antique linen distress ink on Fabriano Artistico Extra White Cold-Pressed watercolour card. And here's my first couple of tips for NoLine watercolouring. Firstly, choose a light water-reactive ink such as antique linen. As you paint, the water in the paint reactivates the ink and it blends with the paint to give a no-line look. If you're using a watery pale colour to paint, for example, the edges of a petal, just make sure to bring your brush over the stamp line a few times to get the ink moving. Secondly, a good watercolour card makes all the difference when watercolouring, whether it be no-line or not. I was recently practicing a freestyle piece at home and grabbed multiple pieces of watercolour card on which to practice, and the results on the better quality card were noticeable. I'm using Fabriano Artistico watercolour card here, but another favourite is Archer's. I chose a cold-pressed watercolour paper which has a slight texture because I like that look, and the texture helps hold the water and allow more time for working. Moving on to the paint, I like Daniel Smith watercolours and I'm using them on this piece. However, I also like all sorts of other watercolour media, from distress inks to Caron brush markers to Mission Gold watercolours, Altenew watercolours. My list could go on and on. I think what I'm trying to say is that the watercolour medium you use is less important than the paper. If you want to invest in just one thing, make it the watercolour card you're using and you'll see the benefit. The process I'm using for NoLine watercolouring is based on getting areas of light and dark. If you paint the whole of a flower in the same depth of colour, it will look very flat and uninteresting. Also, it would be difficult to make out one petal from the next. To get definition and dimension, you want to look for the nooks and crannies, as Kathy Rakusin would say. Please check out Kathy's colouring challenge if you don't already do so. Kathy is amazing at colouring with any medium and has great tips and tricks. Looking for the nooks and crannies and making those where your deepest, most concentrated paint goes, and then spread the paint out more lightly over the rest of the petal, trying to keep one area particularly light as if the sunlight was catching it. When colouring this way, I often use two techniques, the wet and wet technique and the wet on dry technique. Those sound very technical, but in fact it just means how you get the darkest areas spreading out to the lightest. With the wet and wet technique, you can paint the whole of a petal in a clean, clear water and then drop in the paint from your brush in the nooks where the shadows would be. The paint then spreads through the water, getting lighter and more dilute as it does. With the wet on dry technique, you lay down the concentrated paint in the nooks and then use a damp brush to draw out the paint over the rest of the area. Both of these techniques are great for NoLine watercolouring when the aim is to get the transition from dark to light. I often use the wet and dry option when colouring this piece, so you will see me using two paintbrushes. Paint is expensive and I don't want to continuously be washing my brush out and losing all the paint. So I keep one brush with a concentrated mix of paint and one with clean clear water to draw the paint out over the rest of the area. I see some accomplished artists who have both brushes in one hand and can switch from one to the other without pause. However, I'm not that dexterous, and so I keep the brush I'm not using in my other hand. As I go through painting this spring flowers background, I am getting the first layer down. I tend not to go too dark for the first layer. I prefer to build up the colour using layers until I'm happy with the end result. The first layer is the time-consuming bit. However, once the layer is down, for me, that's when the fun bit starts. I love moving around the areas, adding more depth here, a darker shadow there, slowly building and building the contrast. The imagery of this background is particularly great for NoLine watercolouring. Simple lines with defined areas. One thing I forgot to mention up until this point is to avoid painting areas next to each other. or the paint will move over the whole area and blend as one. So you will see me dotting around from one petal to another and looking for where the neighbouring areas are to make sure there is nothing still wet. You can use the heat tool to dry in between, but I prefer to let the paint dry naturally, as I think you see the best blends and bleeds this way. Let's talk about colours for a moment. I chose an analogous colour scheme of reds, oranges and yellows. These are colours next to each other on the colour wheel and work together harmoniously. The leaves and berries in comparison are complementary colours, with the green being complementary to the red and the purple to the yellow. These pops of complementary colour liven up the colour scheme. I think the berries are one of my favourite bits actually. Having mainly kept single colours within each flower group, I'm now adding a few layers of colour into the centres of the flowers from other flowers in the piece. In doing so, I'm adding depth to the centre of the flower where the deeper colours would likely be, and also adding more interest than if I'd left the flowers on one colour. I could easily have kept going, adding more layers, more accents and such, but I decided to leave it at this point and add some splatter. I like to use Winsor & Newton permanent white gouache. I squeezed a little onto my craft mat, mixed it with just enough water so the paint will drop off the brush as I splatter liberally over the piece. I also splattered with a solution of perfect pearls for a little shimmer and shine. Hindsight is a great thing, and in hindsight I should have left the splatter until after this next step, where I darken a few of the areas even more with FABER-CASTELL POLYCHROMO pencils. I chose a few pencils which matched my colour scheme and made sure they were really sharp before going into those nooks and crannies and adding the extra contrast I felt was needed. I used a sepia pencil to add veins to the leaves and some extra depth to the berry tops too. I then set the piece aside while I worked on the sentiment. I love this Summer Roses set from Gina and SSS Stamp, in particular the large script with coordinating smaller sentiments, perfect for adding a skinny strip. Also, this set has matching dies, which means it's perfect for adding the sentiment over the busy panel, so it pops up and stands out. I placed a piece of ivory card in the Misti and treated it with anti-static powder before stamping the large Enjoy greeting in Versamark ink. This is a sticky ink that embossing powder will adhere to. I used antique gold embossing powder from SSS Stamp and made sure to give it a good sprinkling to cover the whole area. I then melted the powder with a preheated heat tool. Once cool, I lined up the matching die, held it in place with washi tape, and ran it through my Gemini Junior die cutting machine. I also stamped and white heat embossed a coordinating sentiment from the Summer Roses Set on Black Card and trimmed to a skinny banner. My plan is to have everything added to an A2 card base, and so I worked out how I wanted everything placed before trimming the watercolour panel to size. I then added foam adhesive to the back of all of the pieces and adhered to the card base, which I cut and scored from ivory card. I used a T-square ruler to ensure I had my skinny strip on straight, as I'm terrible for adding things on at a slight wonk. Finally, I added a few eggshell pearls from Little Things from Lucy's cards, which are held in place with Gina Connect Glue. Well, that's me for this time. I'll leave links in the YouTube description to the products that I've used today, as well as a coordinating link to the blog post over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I'd be delighted if you give it a thumbs up and to subscribe to this channel. Also, if you'd like to get notified when a new video is out, don't forget to hit the bell button next to the subscribe button too. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.